On today's Locked On Jayhawks, will Dajuan Harris play for KU as we preview the Jayhawks against the Bears of Baylor?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thank you for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to Everydayers catching all of the shows. And you can find us on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show or anywhere that you get your podcasts. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we are previewing Kansas Baylor. What's going to happen with Dajuan Harris? Can the Jayhawks win in Waco for the first time in a while? We're going to get into our matchups of the game that could determine it and players to watch and who could go off for KU in this game. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time, where you can download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Get into the KU Iowa State game for $116 right now on Game Time, at least as of recording. Hopefully that deal's still there if you're looking. All right, so KU takes on Baylor. This is a Saturday evening game for KU down in Waco, and this has not been a successful place for KU to play of late. I mean, it makes sense. You think of who have been the best teams in the Big 12 with Kansas, along this past whatever handful of years, right? You think of Houston since they've joined the league these past couple of seasons. You think of Iowa State these past couple of seasons and some of the years in the 2010s, right? You think of some years here and there with maybe Oklahoma or maybe in the early days of Bill Self, Texas. And certainly you think of over the last whatever decade or maybe even a little bit longer than that, Baylor as consistently being one of the top half teams, one of the competitors for the conference with you atop the league. So obviously it's going to be tough when you play a good team on the road. But Kansas has not won in Waco since 2020. Kansas last won in Waco in that crazy game in Waco where Udoka Azubuike just kept dunking the ball and you won at a really good Baylor team. And arguably those were the two best teams in the country. Kansas ends up going 17-1 in Big 12 play that year with their only loss at home to that Baylor team where they beat in Waco in 2020. So that's their last road win in the series. And, we'll see if they can get back on the winning ways there. I think also another headline coming into this one, Kansas trying to build some momentum after the Houston loss, right? Very easy that the Houston loss could have led to your demise in the next game, and it almost did with how that one win against UCF to where you'd really be feeling like if you would have lost that UCF game and you'd be on two straight losses and now you'd be playing at Baylor, a team you haven't won in Waco in 5 years, and then you have Iowa State coming to town on Monday, and then you're on the road against Kansas State, who you've lost on the road to the last couple of years. That is a tough stretch to stare down the barrel if you're KU. So important to win that one, but it'd be even more important if you could win this one and really start to build up some momentum and really feel like you are overcoming what happened in the Houston game. Now, obviously, one big key to this game is going to be what's the health status of Dajuan Harris, of which, and hearing from Bill Self at his press conference ahead of the game in Waco, didn't really get much of an update. The update was, we'll see kind of based on what happens today in practice, which doesn't really tell us what is going to happen. I kind of wonder if I'm going to put, a little bit of I don't know if this is quite tinfoil hat territory, probably not quite that extreme, but I do wonder if Bill Self in the back of his mind is expecting Dajuan Harris to play on Saturday and he didn't want to give anything away to Baylor, right? Obviously, this is a big game. It's played on the road. I wonder if, like in my mind, if you're asking me, if you're just making a reckless prediction, what do you think happens? I'm kind of leaning toward Dajuan Harris ends up playing, but that's without knowing anything as part of this. Like, I'm not in the room. I'm not the doctor here. Like, I have no idea. But it'll certainly have a big impact on the game. We saw it have a big impact in the UCF game. KU had a lot of sloppy turnovers early. Would have helped for KU to have another defensive guard to slow down some good offensive guards for UCF. And that's going to be kind of similar to this Baylor matchup in terms of what they like to do well, shoot threes, or shoot threes well. They have some scoring guards, which let's get into that. Baylor comes in at 13-7 on the season. They're 5-4 in the Big 12 so far this season. They're ranked 26th on KenPom. They're 29th on Bart Torvik. Top 10 offense, basically, right around there. But the defense is outside the top 70, which is honestly very, very similar to where they've been these past 3 seasons. They've consistently been one of the best offenses in the country, but they've consistently been among the teams that have good offenses, one of the worst defenses in the country. And that's really been the case since Jerome Tang left. I'm sure those two things are correlated in a little bit of a way. But they come into this one off an overtime loss in Provo during the week at BYU. Prior to that, they had won 2 in a row. They beat Kansas State and at Utah. And then before that, they had lost 2 in a row at Arizona and at home against TCU. So kind of up and down so far this season. You look at the personnel, there's some really good star power on Baylor this season. They have 2 dynamic freshman guards, 6'1" point guard Rob Wright. He's averaging 12.5 points per game, almost 5 assists, shooting 45% from the floor, 36 from 3, 83 at the foul line. He just had 22 points against BYU. He's been a very impressive freshman for them. Speaking of impressive freshmen, 6'5" guard VJ Edgecombe is probably going to be a lottery pick in the NBA draft. He's averaging 15 points, over 5 rebounds, over 3 assists, over 2 steals per game. He's getting almost a block per game, which is a lot for a guard. 44% from the floor, 39 from 3, 77 at the foul line. So you have these 2 guards in Wright and Edgecombe who are basically combining for 27, 28 points per game. They're doing it on high efficiency. They're hitting their 3 balls. And in the case of Edgecombe, he's averaging 26 points per game over his last 3 games. That is about as dynamic of a backcourt as you could ask for. You look at some of the other games where Kansas has played dynamic backcourts. I think of like Iowa State. Well, that certainly wasn't KU's best defensive game, I would say, or I don't know. I guess they were okay on the defensive end of that game, but you look at the UNC game, like that was a good backcourt, and they certainly gave up a lot on the defensive end. So it'll be interesting to see how that one goes here. They also have Jaden Nunn, who's 6'4", 10 points per game, 44% from 3. He's a sniper outside. Jeremy Roach, the transfer from Duke, he's putting up 12 points per game, but he hasn't played since January 19th against TCU. So I don't know what his status will be for this one. Then you have a couple wings, 6'7", Jalen Celestine. He gets more than 8 per game. He's also a sniper from 3, 39% from 3. And then Jason Asamoah is 6'8". He's more of a glue guy, defensive wing type, but he'll see a little bit of time, not as much as Celestine. The big men are really interesting for Baylor because this is not an overly big team. Norchad Omier is a double-double machine, transfer from Miami, was a starter on their Final Four team. He's only 6'7", listed at 240. He's a mountain of a man on the inside, kind of a bowling ball type. He plays the 4 and the 5. But, don't let the height fool you. He's a very productive player. Over 15 points, over 10 rebounds per game. He's getting over a block, over a steal. He's shooting 57% from the field. Over 2 tries per game from 3, 31%. So he will take them here or there, 70% at the free throw line. He's just a really good player. And then their center, 6'10", 230-pound Josh Ojianwuna. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he plays the 5 for them. 7.4 points per game, 6.7 rebounds per game. He really only shoots it when he's like wide open. If he gets like an uncontested dunk or, an easy lay, he's shooting 76% from the floor, right? Which if you're shooting 76% from the floor, it tells you that you're probably taking a lot of high percentage shots. And if you're only averaging 7.4 points per game, despite shooting 76% from the floor, it kind of tells you that like he's not taking a bunch of like post hooks or like turnaround fadeaways. He's just in the flow of the offense. If you leave him open, he'll throw down a dunk, but then he'll, provide size on the inside. He'll get some rebounds, stuff like that. What Baylor does well, they play slow on the offensive end of the court, but that doesn't change that they are a super efficient offensive team. They don't really turn the ball over. They have a top 20 offensive rebound rate. So they are a team that takes advantage of their possessions, and they're going to outshoot opponents in a lot of ways by not turning it over and getting those offensive rebounds. And then they combine that by being a lethal 3-point shooting team, 37% from 3 essentially so far this season with all those guards that can shoot them. Defensively, they do have a top 50 turnover rate and a top 60 steal rate. So this hasn't been a great defense so far this year, as we talked about, but they do force turnovers. And if Kansas doesn't have Dajuan Harris, maybe that becomes more of a problem for them in this game. What they struggle with, Baylor doesn't get to the free throw line much this season. They get their stuff swatted a ton, which in Big 12 play has been a part of why they only have the 13th best 2-point offense among the 16 teams in the Big 12. So, if you can limit their 3-point shooting, then it's a little bit tough sledding for them to get easy buckets. Defensively, they have struggled at defensive rebounding, and they're sending teams to the line too much. They've also been torched from 3 on the defensive end. So maybe this is a game where KU can get some open shots from 3. And then Baylor's only middle of the pack in a lot of the other defensive numbers. So a lot of times if your defense isn't as good, like maybe you're just horrible at a couple things. It's more so for them. They're just not like great at anything on the defensive end of the court except for really forcing. Let's get to our matchups of the game, players to watch. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Our episode is brought to you by Game Time. This year, Game Time makes it even easier to create those unforgettable moments with their new feature, Game Time Picks. It filters out the fluff and shows you only the best deals on great seats so you can focus on what matters, which is being at the game. I'm looking at tickets right now for the KU Iowa State game, which is Kansas's next home game in the Fieldhouse, and obviously it'll be a big one with Iowa State. Again, by the time you listen to this, it might be gone because it's such a good deal. You can get a upper baseline section 11 row 26 for $116. How about $153 for the upper corner? And that's with the all-in pricing feature toggled. So check that out at Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, continuing on. Thank you for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. Don't forget to check out Locked On College Basketball for your second listen every day. Matchups of the game for Kansas against Baylor for KU to come out on top. Matchup number one is guard the three ball. Kansas just got torched against UCF, right? UCF shot nearly 40% from three, and they did it on super high volume. And I would imagine Baylor saw that film, and they're probably licking their lips coming into this game because they have a ton of three-point shooting threats as a team. They're shooting 37% from three, right? Rob Wright, VJ Edgecombe, Jaden Nunn, Jeremy Roach, if he plays, Jalen Celestine. Like, that's five guys who are legit knockdown shooters. And then, Omir can, at least hit them, right? So it's a team that it comes from a lot of different areas. And in games where the Bears are shooting 37% or better from three-point range, they're 9-1. In games where Baylor is shooting, below that quota, so below 37%, they're only 4-6. If you can limit their three-point shooting, which, sometimes there's only so much you can do about that, right? Sometimes you might have good defense and they might hit a ridiculous three in your face, right? You have to just hope that by consistently not giving up open looks or by not letting them get in a rhythm or by contesting the shots, that more often they do end up missing. But the key there is you have to get out on shooters. You have to chase them off the three-point line and get a hand in their face. If you let them get comfortable, you let them get too many open threes, that's where the problem comes in and they can thrive. The thing for their offense, as we talked about earlier, if they're not a good two-point offense. So if you can take away those three-pointers, they don't have a lot of other ways to beat you. Now, if they're playing Norchad Omir at the 4, then I think Kansas actually might be able to match up okay, because you look at it and with, them basically playing three guards with Nunn at 6'4", basically at the 3 at that point, Omir at the 4, who's kind of an undersized center, and then having a traditional center at the 5, you just think of, okay, well, if KU's playing Flory at the 4 or KJ at the 4, you can match up with that okay. Of course, part of that is assuming KU's not playing three bigs. If KU's playing three bigs, I think this is a horrible matchup for them because you look at it and KJ chasing a guard on, KJ's a really good defender, but he's a good defender on, wings. I don't know that you want him. He doesn't have the foot speed to chase a guard around, right? And he can survive a possession here or there if he has to switch onto him, but that's not going to thrive, right? If you're playing KJ at the 3, Flory at the 4, and Hunter at the 5, and they go with a lineup where they're playing Omir at the 5, sure, you're going to dominate them in size, but they are just going to blitz you with speed and three-point shooting. So that would be a bad matchup. But if KU is just saying we're not going to play the 3 big lineup anymore, which I'm kind of hoping for, and then Omir slides to the 5, I think it'll be interesting to see what KU's counter is. Does Kansas counter by playing small, right? Do they counter by saying we're going to play Ryland Griffin at the 4, or we're going to play AJ Storr at the 4 or something like that? Or do they just say we're going to keep playing it? And I think it'll be very interesting how KU matches up on the defensive end, and can they chase them enough off the three-point line? Number 2, Kansas scoring inside, but not with floaters. Baylor is 4-7 this season when teams shoot 50% or better from 2 against them. They're 9-0 when they don't. Furthermore, they are 0-6 when teams shoot 55% or better from 2-point range. So, again, this kind of goes into the idea that, if you can find a way to score efficiently on the inside, it's tough for them to win these games. And on the season, Kansas is shooting 54.4% on 2s. They're shooting just 51.4%, though, in conference play. That number is just 8th in Big 12 only games. Feels like KU has missed a lot of layups, a lot of shots around the rim, and that's backed up there. They're only middle of the pack in 2-point shooting. But the thing that's weird about it is Kansas has shot 70% at the rim this season, essentially. 70%, that's very good. But the problem is Kansas is taking a lot of floaters and they're taking a lot of mid-range shots, and it is dragging down their 2-point percentage. And you look at the lack of free throw numbers. I know this wasn't the case for the UCF game. KU shot a ton of free throws, but overall in the season, Kansas is not shooting a ton of free throws this year. I think a big reason why is they're settling for those floaters and mid-range shots. Sometimes you just got to kind of be aggressive and say, you know what, I might get hammered here. They might call it, they might not, but like, I'm going to take the layup here. A, because it's a higher percentage shot. B, it gives me a better chance at making a free throw as opposed to throwing up this floater that we've seen Kansas. I think they missed a lot of those in the UCF games specifically. So I want to see Kansas play more aggressive there and attack the rim. Don't just settle for those floaters in mid-range. Baylor, what's interesting, has not been giving up many shots at the rim this year. They have been playing some of that like 1-3-1 that we Scott Drew played for so long before they changed back up to man-to-man. They'll kind of switch it up in what they do. That's part of it. They're in the 93rd percentile in preventing them. Can you find a way to crack into that and still have an efficient 2-point offense, even though they've been kind of taking those away so far this season? Number 3, and our final key to the game matchup for KU, don't let VJ Edgecombe or Rob Wright do what Keyshawn Hall did to you last game. And obviously these are very different players, styles of player, positions that they play, body sizes of the players. But just in terms of having a player go off, right? Having a Keyshawn Hall go for 30-plus points. Edgecombe's getting 26 points per game his last 3. Rob Wright's coming off a 22-point game. Both of them represent players that can go off in any given game. Can you hold both of them under 20? Right? If you can do that, I think you might be okay. I mean, I guess if they both get 19 points, like, is that really that much better? I don't know. It kind of depends on what happens with other stuff. But, like, can you avoid one of them from just absolutely going off and torching you? That would, I think, go a long way for Kansas and, I don't know, kind of keeping the crowd out of it maybe a little bit more. Don't let them kind of take over the game because it becomes tenfold if Keyshawn Hall would have been doing that in the game in Orlando. And, I think this all kind of goes back to like what's going to happen with Dajuan Harris, right? Because I view Shaquille Moore as being a good defender, though I don't think he had his best defensive game last game against UCF, but I do think overall he's a good defender. And if you have Dajuan Harris and Shaquille Moore, that's super helpful because they have those two dynamic guards that you can say, okay, we're just going to put those two on those two and try to match up and try to limit them a little bit more than they're used to. But if Dajuan can't go, and even if you say, even if Shaquille Moore has a good defensive game on one of those guys, and the other one goes off, right? So I think that'll be very interesting in how that does kind of have an impact on the game. All right, let's get on to our players to watch, player matchups, player everything can go off. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for joining us on LOJ. We'll have a post-game recap of the KU Baylor game coming at you later this weekend, and possibly any other news if there's any breaking news in some sort of way. Get to that on Locked On Jayhawks. So make sure to subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast. Don't forget you can check out Locked On College Basketball for your second listen every day as well. Our player matchup here, I mean, going back to what we were just talking about, I think if Dewan Harris plays for KU, it ends up being Edgecombe. Well, it'll be interesting. I think it makes sense to put Shaquille Moore on Edgecombe because Shaquille Moore has a little bit more build to him, right? And Edgecombe's a little bit bigger. And then you put Dajuan Harris on Rob Wright. But I think those are the matchups, right? It's Wright / Edgecombe versus Harris and Shaquille Moore. But again, if Dajuan can't go, then how do you kind of operate that if you're Kansas? The other interesting matchup to me is just kind of the, Norchad Omier versus whatever position he is playing at that given time. If Omier's playing at the 4, I think he's going to have a bit of a strength advantage on even KJ. I mean, KJ is a strong guy, but that actually could be an okay matchup for KU if he's at the 4. If he's at the 5, I think you look at it and say, throw the ball to Hunter every possession. If you have this 6'7" center trying to guard him at the other end, and if they double team him, then Hunter ends up with 7 assists, in the night. So I think that's going to be interesting, the kind of the chess match at both ends, how that impacts things. And then also, if you have lineups where Flory's at the 4 and Omier's at the 4, how does that work? Because you have the length, the athleticism, the wingspan of Flory versus the just pure grit and size of Omier. Is he able to bully Flory, who's, probably going to be looking to add some weight in the offseason, right? Versus, Flory's athleticism and length bother Omier in a weird way. I think that's going to be just a super fascinating matchup based on where he's playing. Now, as far as our high on the go off meter, so if you look at it, Evan Mia rates Rob Wright as the 140th best defender among 142 qualified in the Big 12. Now, I do take some of those numbers with a grain of salt because it's based on like box score plus minus when you're on the court. It can be a bit dependent on your teammates a little bit here and there. And, I don't know, but like I do find that interesting because that is a very low number on there. Does that mean that Kansas can take advantage of it, right? If he's guarding Dajuan Harris, can Dajuan have a good scoring game if he plays? Does this mean a game where like Diggy Coit coming off the bench, if he's being guarded by Rob Wright, like maybe Diggy Coit can follow up what he just did with another good performance? I also think in going back in their looking back at their 5 most recent box scores, there was a backup big man for BYU who had over 20 points. Ernest Uday, obviously we're very familiar with him, 16 points at the center position. And then a backup Arizona 7-footer had 19 off the bench. And those are all games within the last 5. I'm going to actually pick Flory Bidunga for my answer here because I do think on the offensive end, I could see Flory being able to finish over Omier in that situation. I could see Flory being the recipient if they're playing that 1-3-1 zone of catching a lob and throwing down a dunk in a lot of ways, slipping behind the defense, getting those dunks. And I'm going to say Flory has a big game in Waco. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. Back for a KU Baylor recap later this weekend. See you then with LOJ.